it might be useful to try to figure out where we are at the present moment. So I'm going to go through quickly 6 topics, but I'll do it expeditiously, and then you can question me on those that interest you. First of all, what happened on October 7th? I think it's pretty murky exactly what happened. It's unclear what Hamas's goals were. It's unclear what the extent to which the actions that occurred on October 7th were from the top down, they were orders, or whether they were from the bottom and they were spontaneous initiatives. All of that, I think, is unclear, and unless somebody miraculously steps forward from the other side, it's quite possible we'll never know. The bottom line, I think, is to some extent clear. About 1,200 people were killed. About 400 were technically combatants. 800 were civilians. And of those 800, I think, judging from what others have said, I've not followed it closely, but basing it myself on the good judgment of others, I would say a fair statement would be that a clear majority of the civilians were killed by Hamas and other militant groups. The more lurid aspects that were touted by Israel, the beheadings, seem almost certainly to have been fabricated. If you look at the statement, or I should say the oral proceedings of the ICJ, they did not mention the beheadings in their descriptions of what happened on October 7th. They, meaning the Israelis, didn't mention the beheadings. The other lurid headline was the rapes. I would say the evidence of mass rapes is quite clearly at this point, and I'll be happy to go into it if anybody wants to discuss it. There's no evidence whatsoever, zero, that there were mass rapes on October 7th. There's no evidence, zero, that rapes were being weaponized as a tactic of war. I would say the evidence at this point is, at best, and again I'll be happy to go through it, at best there were isolated instances of rape, and quite possibly the October 7th event occurred in 3 waves. The first wave was Hamas commandos, the second wave were other militant groups who assisted the commandos, and then there was a third wave of kind of anonymous random people from Gaza who entered, and I think it's quite plausible that the isolated incidents of rape were committed by what you might call the riffraff and hooligan elements that came in the third wave into Gaza. At least that's what the evidence seems to show. So that's the factual side. The second thing, challenge is, well, once you have the facts, how do you understand them? How do you assimilate them? And I think it's a normal human reflex that you try to assimilate or understand an isolated set of facts, but try to find relevant analogies which make sense of it, historical analogies. And I did ponder after October 7th, in particular after, say, October 9th, when it became clear that something, pretty massive atrocities had occurred, to try to make sense of it without going into it now. Again, if you want to pursue it, I'll be happy. To me, the most sensible analogy was to conceive what happened on October 7th as a slave revolt. And the slave revolts, whether you read C.L.R. James or you read our own American history, the slave revolts were quite gruesome affairs. In the case of our own Turner, he gave the order to kill all whites. He and his, so to speak, Confederates proceeded to do just that. They did literally chop off the heads of babies and disemboweled people, killed about 61 white folks, And Nat Turner was a religious fanatic, for sure. So when you read the history of the slave revolts, it matches up pretty closely with what happened on October 7th. The paradox is, and we can discuss that later as well, the paradox is, as gruesome as the Nat Turner revolt was, if you look at the actual details. For those of you who don't know American history, the Nat Turner revolt in 1831 was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Notwithstanding the gruesome details, the Nat Turner revolt now honors an honorable place in American history. And it does cause you to think or to wonder if humanity survives, how the October 7th events are going to be understood sometime in the future. Now, the third question is Israel's reaction. How do we make sense of this escalating, unfolding, relentless, plausible genocide, to use the terminology of the International Court of Justice? I would say there are three aspects to the Israeli reaction. The first aspect is perfectly obvious. It's bloodlust, the desire to get revenge for what happened on October 7th. The bloodlust is slightly more complicated, I would say, because the desire for revenge is combined with a total indignation, a phenomenal indignation that how did these Untermenschen, these subhumans, how did they manage to pull off this operation, as it's called, inside Gaza, breaking through the gates of Gaza, that it seemed to show a quite high level of sophistication, which Untermenschen, subhumans, are not supposed to possess. And it incensed the Israelis because it was a fantastic humiliation for the state of Israel. In my generation, Israel was known as a kind of James Bond writ large, with their commando raids, the most famous being the commando raid at Entebbe. With their commando raids, their cutting-edge technology, including, of course, surveillance technology. Gaza is such a tiny place. It's a pinprick of a pinprick on the world's map. And yet they managed to pull off a quite sophisticated operation, which actually astonished them how easy it was. And so it was a very big humiliation for Israel. So the bloodlust is combined with the anger. It's not unlike, incidentally, the anger that the Nazis felt at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They were so furious, even though the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising factually was a very small affair. The Nazis were totally incensed, and then if you looked at the rubble that was left after the uprising when they leveled the ghetto, it was the same kind of indignation by the Übermenschen, the supermen, when this vermin somehow demonstrates a kind of sophistication and technical prowess which Untermenschen are not supposed to possess. That's one aspect. The second aspect, and it's a critical one, and it's almost, you could say, understandable, if we're allowed to say that in this context. Namely, Israel has always counted on what it calls its deterrence capacity. And deterrence capacity, it's just a fancy term for the Arab world's fear of Israel. And after October 7th, there was a genuine fear on the side of Israelis, a genuine concern on the side of Israelis, that the Arab world no longer feared them. That if you talk to people afterwards from Arab and Muslim background, there was a sort of kind of epiphany, hey, maybe Israel isn't as strong as we all thought it was. Maybe it's not as clever as we all thought it was. And Israel was very concerned that the Arab world no longer feared it, that, as I said, the technical term they call it is deterrence capability or deterrence capacity. And the way Israel has historically restored its deterrence capacity whenever it seems a little bit weak is these high-tech massacres, which were already mentioned by the fellow who spoke before me, most famously Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, then Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, then Operation Protective Edge in 2014. These high-tech massacres designed not just to subdue the population of Gaza, but much more importantly, to transmit a message to the rest of the Arab world that if you get a little bit too cocky, we're going to do to you what we're doing right now to Gaza. And after that spectacular event on October 7th, the Israelis now felt they had to do something equally spectacular in response in order to restore the Israeli government's or the Israeli state's deterrence capacity. And the third aspect of the Israeli reaction was, everybody knows the cliche that every crisis is also an opportunity. And Israel saw October 7th as an opportunity, and I think the language is fair, to finally have a solution to this Gaza question. Gaza has been a problem for Israel since 1948. You can go through one massacre after another massacre after another massacre after another massacre, literally. And it was interesting, for those of you who are interested, when I was rereading my book on Gaza in preparation for a number of speaking engagements, at the very end of the book, maybe next to the last page, I quote an Israeli as saying, we can't continue with this war of attrition with Gaza, the operation after the operation after the operation. And the Israeli said, the next war with Gaza will be the last. And it turned out, I think, that turned out to be accurate. Of course, the person didn't predict October 7th, but October 7th was the crisis which created the opportunity. And so they want to solve the Gaza question for once and for all. They're very determined now. And they have, you have to say, they do have, or they had until they went over the top. They had an impressive pretext. As to how they want to solve it, I would say on a spectrum, originally in the first few weeks, they were hoping for the ethnic cleansing, basically the first couple of weeks, to expel the entire population to Egypt. That didn't work out because President Sisi gave a clear sign, we're not going to go along with that. That's on the one end of the spectrum. In the middle of the spectrum, you would say their aim was to make Gaza uninhabitable and give the people a fait accompli, as one of the Israeli senior analysts or senior policymakers put it, Giora Eiland. He said, we're going to give the Gazans two choices, starvation or leave. That is to say, totally annihilate Gaza, so there's nothing to go back to. And in large part, there isn't anymore anything to go back to. You can't go back to your home in the north because literally, you can't go back to your home in the north because you don't know where it was. The place has been pulverized. There have already been stories of people who went back and they have no idea where their home was. So to make Gaza totally uninhabitable and then confront people with the option of starvation because there's nothing there, or leave. And the third option you might call, the third along the spectrum, is the Amalek option, namely just wipe out the population. So I think that's basically the spectrum. Obviously, they're not discrete. The ethnic cleansing bleeds into making Gaza uninhabitable, and that bleeds into wiping out the population. So I think that's basically what Israel's objective is. What happened on that date, October 7th and thereafter, was it a game changer? I remember a very close friend of mine, Muin Rabbani, he said, told me right after, he said, well, don't you think it's a game changer? I said, well, not really, because I've lived through Cast Lead, I've lived through Protective Edge. Yes, this is worse. But there is a game changer in one sense, in my opinion. The game changer is that diplomacy is now off the table. The Israelis are determined to get a military victory. They will not accept anything less than a major defeat inflicted on Hamas and a major defeat subsequently inflicted on Hezbollah. They will not accept less than a clear-cut military victory. On the other side, the Hamas and what's called the Axis of Resistance, they now believe, because of what happened October 7th, they now believe a military victory on their side is within reach. That was the belief of people like Saad Nasrallah, the head of the Hezbollah, but it was not widespread. Everybody feared Israel militarily. After October 7th, people reconsidered whether or not Israel was as invulnerable as was believed. So, and the other thing is, Saad Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, he has set one red line. The red line is, we won't accept a Hamas military defeat. We will not accept it. And so you have, on one side, Israel saying, we will not accept anything less than inflicting a defeat on Hamas. And on the other side, you have Hezbollah saying, we will not accept a military defeat for Hamas. And so in my view, that means for the foreseeable future, this is going to be played out on the battlefield. I don't see a diplomatic possibility or option at the present moment or in the foreseeable future. And with that, all of that grimness, I have to, not because I'm obliged, but because I think we have to have a balanced picture, there are some reasons for hope. I thought the intervention of South Africa was not only spectacular, but it did mark a change in world politics. From very early on, already in October, there were many people saying, call on the Genocide Convention, bring in the Genocide Convention, bring in the Genocide Convention. I said, that's totally crazy. What government is going to stand up to the United States and call in or invoke the Genocide Convention? I was totally astonished that South Africa not only took up the baton, but it has been absolutely relentless. If you read their application to the International Court of Justice, it was very impressive. That took a lot of work.
Norm, could I please I hate to interrupt you, but could I please ask for you to begin to wrap up your opening remarks?
Yeah.
I'm just concerned with the Q&A.
Yeah, okay. So I think that was grounds for hope. And the other thing I would want to say is, I think it's a point of principle, and it was mentioned by you and also by the Ava Porter. Remind me of your name?
Joe Whitcomb.
Joe, okay. And that is the relentlessness of the young people in our country since October 7th has been absolutely breathtaking. The fact that you folks, the young folks, keep coming out, won't accept defeat, won't fall into despair. It's a deeply inspiring sight. And it makes me, at any rate, hopeful. 2 weeks ago, I was at the demonstration which began at Washington Square. It was a very rainy day, and it was a Saturday. And it was, I think I was, the next oldest person after me was 25. I swear, no, I'm not kidding. It was a 40-year gap there. And these young people were just absolutely awe-inspiring. The energy, the commitment, and as a friend of mine said, he said, they have no stake in this. It's solidarity, to use your generation's expression, you'll understand the modification. It's solidarity without benefits. It's a very impressive sight, and they went from the street. We went down to the subway because we climaxed at 42nd Street. We went down the subway, and they were on both sides of the platform. They were still chanting. They were still demanding. It was a great sight. There's an interesting question: what accounts for that selfless solidarity? I'm not going to go through that whole thing for you now, but they considered Oslo a sellout. They didn't want to participate in anything that was in any way an offshoot of the Oslo process, but they were convinced. Finally, they changed their position. They participated in the elections. And surprising to them, as anyone else, they won the parliamentary election. They came into power. The first thing the United States and Israel and the EU did was to slap brutal economic sanctions on Gaza. That was the thank you for participating in the elections. Now, once Hamas came into power, there's a rich documentary record. Hamas was moving closer and closer to accepting the international consensus for resolving the conflict, namely 2 states on the June 1967 border. Everybody knows it. Every time they moved closer and closer to accepting that 2-state consensus for resolving the conflict, with the one question where the law was on their side, but it was a gray area, namely the question of the refugees, the right of the return of the refugees, where the law was on their side, but we'll leave that on the side for a moment. Every time Gaza got closer, Hamas got closer and closer to accepting a diplomatic solution to the problem, Israel engaged in one of its high-tech massacres. If you know the Israeli scholarship, that's called the Israeli fear of Palestinian, and I'm using their words, not mine, the fear of the Palestinian peace offensive. They don't want a diplomatic settlement because they don't want to withdraw. So every time, be it the PLO at one period, Hamas in another period, every time they inched closer and closer to that 2-state settlement, Israel escalated its violent, its military, its brutal provocations. There didn't seem to be any hope for a diplomatic solution. Then along came March 2018, which came to be called the Great March of Return. Initially, that was not a Hamas undertaking. It was spontaneous. It was from the grassroots. It was massive civil disobedience, very similar to our own civil rights movement, and then the first Intifada in 1987 to 1993. Okay, Hamas joined in. It gave its seal of approval to massive nonviolent civil disobedience. What happened? Well, we have very good human rights reports on it from Human Rights Watch, from an international investigation committee, UN committee. To quote the UN committee, Israel targeted intentionally. It targeted children. It targeted medics. It targeted journalists. And it targeted disabled people, people in wheelchairs or crutches. And it also targeted from the knee down to inflict life-changing, that's the expressions used, life-changing injuries on the protesters. That went on for about 6 weeks. Then along came May 14th, and Israel committed a massacre on May 14th, and then the nonviolent option began to extinguish. So they tried diplomacy, it failed. They tried nonviolent civil disobedience, it failed. Then,
I'll give you a minute.
as October 7th came along, it was pretty clear, even to myself. I had given up on Gaza. I had moved on and was writing on other topics. It was clear that the next step was going to be, after the Abraham Accords, there was going to be an accord with Saudi Arabia, and the Palestine question was going to be finished. It would be over. They were out of the picture. And it was at that moment, after attempting diplomacy, after attempting nonviolent resistance, and when it seemed like their fate was sealed. Now, you know what your fate is sealed means? It means that in 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, he described Gaza as, quote, I'm quoting him now, a huge concentration camp. So, when you say the fate is sealed, it means all these people, they were born into a concentration camp. From day one, because most of the folks who came through the gates on October 7th were in their early 20s. They were born into a concentration camp, and it looked like they were going to die in it. Now, what they intended to do on October 7th, I don't have a clue. I don't think it's clear at all. Dan says they wanted to provoke an uprising in the Muslim world. Maybe you have a special pipeline to Hamas. I don't. Because what we do know is Hamas did not tell Hezbollah what it was going to do. Hamas did not tell Iran what it was going to do. That doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do if you want to provoke an uprising in the Arab Muslim world. You're not telling your ostensible allies what you're going to do. And they were kind of peeved about that. That we know also, that they were taken by surprise. So rather than just label Hamas with a sweeping stroke and playing a clairvoyant, I know what they intended to do, I think we should just look at the historical record, first of all, and secondly, show a little sympathy. You can call it a right-wing organization, you can call it a this organization or that organization. I think it was an impossible situation. I don't know what they intended to do, but I certainly know, because the factual record is there, they tried very hard to resolve this conflict either diplomatically or through, brace yourself, nonviolent tactics, which I'll tell you, I encouraged. And it was like egg on my face when not only did it prove to be a disaster, but there was zero solidarity from the international community. ZERO. No support for the Great March of Return, which also was a disappointment to them.
We got to get
Okay.
questions. All right, thank you. Get my question first. Yeah, you.
Okay. Thank you to all of the panelists. So one term that came up several times across many of the different presentations is solidarity. And I wanted to ask where the strategy of solidarity for the left comes from and what it means. What would it mean to be in solidarity with the struggle of the Palestinians? And how would that contribute to the goal many of the panelists stated they had, which was socialism? Will socialism be furthered through the politics of solidarity? Does the left internationally or in the U.S. need to lead in order for something like socialism or revolution or these sorts of politics to be possible? And is that actually accomplished through a politics of solidarity? I think part of what Dan seems to be raising is that, well, okay, you could have a ceasefire and the reconstruction of Gaza, but who would end up kind of getting the better end of that? Well, wouldn't it just be the national bourgeoisie? Wouldn't it be a more or less right-wing party, whether that be Hamas or another political organization that could come about in the future? So I wanted to ask kind of in a broad way, why should the left be in solidarity? What do those politics mean? And what does this have to do with the ultimate goal of something like socialism or transforming our society? Thank you.
Any of you can feel free.
Yeah, first of all, let me just get one thing out of the way. The 1988 Charter makes quite clear that the Hamas calls for a general Islamic uprising as a solution to the problem. So I'm not clairvoyant, I simply know how to read a document, and the document is quite explicit, number one. Also, number two, Hamas leaders such as Ghazi Hamad have made statements to this effect after the October 7th uprising. So there really is no mystery as to what Hamas's strategy was. And as a question of tarring them with a broad brush, Hamas is an Islamist right-wing organization. They attempted to assassinate the Muslim Brotherhood, attempted to assassinate Nasser. They have been involved in attacks on communists throughout the Middle East. They sided with the U.S., Saudis, Britain, and France in the civil war in Syria, an attempt to overthrow the Assad government. They have played a pernicious pro-imperialist role throughout their history. So there's not a question of tarring with a broad brush. It's simply a question of facing facts as to the true political nature of Hamas. Now, in response to the question of solidarity is that socialism is all about equality. It's about freedom, national freedom, the removal of the imperialist yoke, the ability of Palestinians and all other colonial or neo-colonial people to take their place in the international socialist community as equals. And that is why socialists fight to defend the Palestinian people against this horrendous onslaught. And the only way to do that is via a socialist movement, via an international working class movement. And simply an Islamist revolt will only lead to catastrophe, as is being borne out on a daily basis in Gaza. And by the way, this is not an attempt to put the blame on Hamas, because Hamas is the weaker of the two parties. Israel is the stronger, therefore Israel deserves the lion's share of the blame. But what we're seeing here is a mutual spiral downward. And the ideological convergence, as I said before, is really quite striking. So we need to have a working class, anti-imperialist, socialist movement which fights for the equality and the possibility of democratic socialist development for all people in the Middle East, including the Jews in Israel, the Palestinians, and all other minorities in the Arab world, who, by the way, are fiercely, in the Muslim world, who are fiercely oppressed. So that is essentially the essence of the socialist solidarity campaign.
Why is this a left cause? Maybe you can answer this, Norm, as well, because all of you here have come, and this is a left perspectives panel. I'm just curious, what does the left have to offer to this cause that the right doesn't? Because brotherhood clearly is something that the right can provide, for instance.
Selectively.
I guess my point is, what is, why are you as leftists? Is it simply brotherhood? Is it simply a better deal that the left can provide? It doesn't seem as though there's any sort of left leadership in the United States, at least, that's taking responsibility for the crisis.
I'm going to make, I owe it to Oliver to answer that question, but then I want to go back to a couple of other things. It's always been a value of the left, solidarity with the oppressed, or as Frantz Fanon famously put it, with the wretched of the earth. If you read the writings of obviously Marx in that tradition had solidarity with the proletariat in part for the obvious reason that they represented the most, to use the language of that era, the most alienated portion of our world, the ones who lacked the basic necessities of life, those who lacked any control over their lives. Obviously, with the proletariat, it was something also. They represented a historic force, an organized force, and so on and so forth. But at bottom, it was the wretched of the earth. If you read the writings of Rosa Luxemburg, she was deeply sympathetic, almost prescient, given the era in which she lived, with the sufferings of people in South America, in Africa, and she writes about it with a great deal of humanity. That was part of what it meant to be part of the left. So when a people was facing in real time a genocide, it would be a normal cause. It would be very odd if the left were indifferent given its tradition. It would be very odd if they were indifferent to the fate of the people of Gaza. Having said that, and I hope that was responsive to your question, there's always a danger of, I think, internalizing too uncritically cliches that float around in the journalism and in the punditry world. So let's take a couple of phrases. Number one, the most right-wing government in Israel's history. I'm not sure really what that means. Israel's first government carried out the expulsion of the indigenous population. Now that was, by technical terms, that was a very left-wing government. We shouldn't forget that. The government in 1948, what was called it was socialist and also communist, the Mapai and the Mapam. Those were members of the Second International. Parts of it, that movement were very pro-Stalin, very pro-Soviet Union. So you could be technically on the left and still part of a quite ugly history. The two go hand in hand. So to call this the most right-wing government, what happened to Israel's most left-wing government, namely the one in 1948, its most left-wing government, which created the problem in the first place by carrying out the expulsion of the indigenous population. Now, many of you are too young to remember, in fact all of you, except possibly Dan, because I don't know our age difference. The biggest bloodletting before the current one, the biggest bloodletting was how I got started in this cause in the first place. It was 1982. And that was the invasion of Lebanon. The estimates are about 15 to 20,000 people were killed. It was the largest number by far until the current disaster. Now that was a Labor Likud government. The Labor government supported the invasion of Lebanon. That's the left. But they supported the invasion of Lebanon. So to characterize this as the most right-wing government, I would say domestically that's true in terms of all sorts of legislation to roll back the liberal era. But in foreign policy, I don't think it's particularly right-wing, the Israeli government today. There's no dissent whatsoever. If you look at the polls, look at the polling data. 90% of Israeli society believes, in the latest polls, 90% believe that Israel is either using enough force or not enough force in Gaza. Only 10% believe they're using too much force. That's the whole society. So to talk about it in isolation as the right-wing government, no. It's the whole society. Israel has a right, a far right, and an ultra-right. There is no center, and there is no left. And the last thing is, not to beat a dead horse, but the biggest propaganda victory for Israel, the biggest propaganda victory for Israel is that since October 7th, we're told it's an Israel-Hamas war. It's not an Israel-Hamas war. Long before Hamas came into power in 2006. Remember, Giora Eiland described Gaza as a huge concentration camp in 2004, before Hamas came into power. Already in 1990, Israel was imposing the closure on Gaza, which culminated in the blockade. The problem hasn't been Hamas. The problem has been the people of Gaza, and I'm not going to mythify them, but the people of Gaza have refused to acquiesce to their fate. That's why initially, right after October 7th, they weren't talking about Hamas, they were talking about the people of Gaza. We're going to finally settle accounts with the people of Gaza. It's not an Israel-Hamas war. It's an Israel-Gaza war.
Norm, you raised this kind of interesting point a little bit obliquely, where you said, you seemed to sort of imply that it was an open question that humanity would even remember this, implying that perhaps we were facing sort of like mass extinction. So I guess the question that raised for me was, how do these current conflicts point to that? And what can be done to avoid it? Dan, you used this sort of pithy term of like the 100 Years' War, right? That somehow there's been this continuity since, I guess, 1914 into the present of like a total global cataclysm brought on by militarization. So my question, I guess, would be, how does this conflict point to that as a possibility? And what can be done to avert it? And is a pessimism about that a response to a sort of belief that perhaps the immediate and more long-term demands of the left are ineffectual in the face of the conflict?
I don't mean to say they're ineffectual at all. I mean, I think that huge battles lie ahead. I don't think the left is ineffectual. I think the left has been thrown on the defensive. It has retreated. It's been, the forces are against it. The class forces are favoring the far right at this moment. But I think that the only hope lies in the left, and I think that the left can eventually prevail. But I don't want to minimize the struggle by any means. I think that we're entering into an era of war, of growing war. We have Emmanuel Macron talking about sending French troops into the Ukraine. It looks like the Ukraine is beginning to collapse, and the idea of a Russian victory in the Ukraine is throwing Europe into a panic. I think the war in Gaza is. I don't see any resolution. I think it's just going to get uglier and uglier. I think it's a good chance that Trump will be elected, and that Trump, if anything, is certainly absolutely pro-Israel, but is probably even friendly to the Kahanist wing of the Netanyahu government. So I think that we're facing a period of widening waves of warfare. And I haven't even mentioned global warming or the economy. But I think that that essentially what is good is that the world is an ever tighter unit. That essentially the proletariat engaged in capitalist production has basically tripled or quadrupled since the 1980s. That there is the basis for international proletarian solidarity that's being laid, which will eclipse any previous period. So I think that there is a potential for a global socialist movement to essentially to launch a counteroffensive against this completely suicidal, nihilistic, far-right capitalist drive.
I guess I will pose a brief question. I guess what you're talking about, Dan, is this opportunity that exists. And to me, it seems like what you're getting at is that what's going on now is, I guess, we today have an anti-war movement, and it seems totally ineffectual. If we're not just going to continue with the same trajectory of the last 100 years, does the left have anything at all to offer, or is it merely going to be, as it was, as you mentioned, in Israel previously under the Labour government? Yeah.
I don't see any point in throwing cold water on people's efforts. The anti-war movement in the United States, it began in 1964. There wasn't the first mass demonstration in the United States until 1967. It took a long time. People thought before the 2003 Gulf War, there were the biggest demonstrations, as all of you know, in world history. And yes, the war happened, but you can't expect it. You're up against it's just an obvious fact. You're up against a very organized and very powerful and very concentrated ruling elite. It's very tough. It's a tough battle. But we shouldn't poo-poo efforts that are being made. I don't think it's true to say that we haven't had any impact. Somebody said, I was in a debate the other day with Israel's chief historian, Benny Morris. And Benny Morris said, if Israel wanted to, it could have killed 500,000 people, meaning the army. No, I said, no, you can't kill 500,000 people because there are constraints in the real world. The constraints are the ones we create. There are mass demonstrations, there are mass protests. All those demonstrations, all those protests, now I know it's not going to be much of a solace to you, but they actually do impose restraints. When the Israeli minister said, why don't we just nuke Gaza? Well, because they can't. Do they want to? Of course they want to. But they can't, because there are constraints in the real world. And one of the constraints is the massive outpouring of support for the people of Gaza. Now, did it save 10 lives? Did it save 100 lives? Did it save 1,000 lives? I can't tell you that. That's impossible to quantify. But I don't think we should, on the other hand, we shouldn't be so dismissive of all of those heroic efforts. Each time there was a demonstration in Grand Central Station, a demonstration was it Staten Island at the Statue of Liberty? Each of those demonstrations, they do something. There's been a fantastic change in public opinion. I go back to a day when you had 20 people demonstrating, and you consider that a big demonstration. That's how movements are built. If you want something overnight, it's not going to happen. But on the other hand, I think it's been extremely impressive what's happened. Even though I'll admit it's impossible to quantify how many lives were saved. So I'm not prepared to dismiss what's happened. It's been absolutely deeply moving, deeply inspiring, to watch it unfold, to see all of Grand Central Station filled with Jews opposing the war or the extermination. That was spectacular.
Yeah, so the question to you, and then it's that how do you explain this sort of peculiar conflict, so to speak? It seems to me it's more than just a socialist issue or a capitalist issue. It's more of like I guess an ethno-religious nationalist kind of project that I feel like is going on. How do you really explain it, if at all? Okay.
I don't think there is an answer to an easy answer to that question, but I think it would be foolish to deny that that the capitalist system is deeply implicated in what's happening. Now, exactly how you want me to connect that broad generalization with the state of Israel, and am I going to just bring in and say, oh, it's all about oil or something like that? No, I don't think it's all about oil, and I don't think it's all about gas. And I do think that going from the generalization to the specific, it's not easy to figure out. But on the other hand, I don't think I believe it's correct to say that there is a connection between the local and the specifics, the local aspects and the specific aspects, and the system as a whole. Now, exactly how you work out the connections, I think that's difficult. But I do believe it's there,